My name is Ian. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. For 30 years, I've been digging around in old 78 RPM discs in languages other than English. I only read and speak English. I am a fully melting potted Delawarean with no ties to any homeland whatsoever. So I got interested in recordings in languages other than English because they seem to indicate other worlds where I could find stuff. In the process of doing that, I wound up using the format of reissuing recordings as a way of telling some stories that I learned along the way of some of the music that I encountered that was, at times, unbelievably good, and which other people around me, teachers, my parents, serious record people, researchers, folklorists, seem not to know anything about. So, sort of using that as a storytelling medium. The other storytelling medium has always been people come over to the house and I play them some records and I tell them a story about it. And that got elaborated over the course of 20 years into me touring around, playing a record, telling a story, playing a record, telling a story, which is almost what I'm going to be doing tonight, except that I'm going to spend the whole time telling one story about one person who I got really interested in, who was from here, kind of. Her name was Zabelle Panosian. So to tell you her story, I'm actually going to begin with the corny thing of a Shakespearean epigraph. Twelfth Night, sex comedy. There's a guy and it says, nowadays you have to build your own monument or you'll be forgotten as soon as the church bell stops ringing and your widow stops weeping. And his friend says, well, how long is that? And he says, an hour in clamor and a quarter in room. 75 minutes until the process of forgetting starts, which is exactly the amount of time that it takes to tell this story. It so happens. It's a story about someone who got forgotten, who did the work, built the monument, got forgotten anyway, and is now getting to stand up and walk and live among us again a little bit. So, her name, when she was born, was Takoe Dermazropian. She was born in a place called Bardizak, 80 miles due east from Constantinople, Istanbul, in 1891. Bardizak was a town of about 10,000 people. It was 8% Armenian. It's basically all Armenians for several hundred years. The way they accomplished that was through a combination of discretion, keeping their head down, not causing trouble, and bribery. Once a year, you have an Ottoman official in, and you give him a nice dinner, give him a couple of drinks, hand him an envelope, and say, now it seems to us that it is for the benefit of the eternal souls of our Muslim neighbors that they not be around us non-believers. Don't you think that's true? Well, yes, as a matter of fact, I think that's exactly right, and I will express that to my countrymen. So, it's this autonomous Armenian town, hundreds of years. That's where Zabelle was from. And that's where she went to church, started singing Sor Hagop. In the middle of Main Street, one of two churches. There were two silk mills, one on either side of Main Street, and the whole village was surrounded by mulberry groves where the silkworms fed. So, when she was 9 years old, the first bad thing happened. Turkish military men came into her house at night, took her from bed, put her on horseback, and rode her off to sing and dance for other Turkish military men. So she said, 1917, 1918. She was returned, unharmed, we hope. 11 years old, the next bad thing happens. Her mother dies. 15 years old, the third bad thing happens. There's another abduction attempt. She's 15. Her father and some family friends get in the way and keep her safe. But her father realizes, we have to get you out of here. You are not safe. 15-year-old girl. So, they send her off. The revolutionary activity was that was going on in the Ottoman Empire among Armenians was the government worried so much about it that they restricted passports for Armenians only within the borders of the empire. You couldn't get to America except to be, trafficked, basically. So what they wound up doing was sending her to Egypt, where apparently some family friends, at 15 years old, got her passage to Boston, where there was a guy named Zabelle Panosian, about 10, 15 years older than her, who was from Bartizag, and who had just started, 1907, 1908, working for the Tickner Brothers Postcard Company, significant developers in the history of the picture postcard, a new mass media form, right? Aram did very well, and he was extremely supportive of Zabelle. Got her help around the house. She was a refugee girl, didn't speak English, and the following year, 1 month after her 18th birthday, she gave birth to their daughter, Adrina. So, new mother, so she's got some domestic help. He gets her English lessons. And then he gets her singing lessons. She wants to sing. With first 2 guys named Hooker and Graham, from whom she said she learned practically nothing. And then from a woman who was in her 60s, childless widow who was a professional vocal coach named Gertrude Duena here in Boston. She regularly gave concerts of her students. Zabelle was very devoted to Gertrude Duena and said that she learned the delicacies of the art of singing from her. Now, this is about 1910. 1910, in America, we were in the grips of opera mania. It was the height of glamour and sophistication as a performer, opera, the big thing. And Boston, right at that time, got its own opera company, got its own opera house. The opera company only lasted 4 years. It was the scheme of a guy named Otto H. Kahn, a assimilated, deracinated Jew who you may recognize as Roscoe W. Chandler in the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers. Chico says, wait, I know you. You from Czechoslovakia. You're A.B. the Fishman. Shut up. He was a philanthropist and an art collector. Groucho made fun of him all his life. Anyway, that's the guy who built the Boston Opera Company. And Zabelle went. She saw it. She said, for the rest of her life, that she was of the Boston Opera Company, which is not true. She never had a role. Maybe she put on a costume and, had a walk-on part in a chorus or something. I am in the next couple of days, going to the archive at Northeastern to double check, see if there's any documentation at all. But anyway, she was not she liked it. They brought really good singers, Luisa Tetrazzini and really, really good people, like top-level singers, sang here in Boston for 4 years, and that was it. Boston could not support its own opera company. There were 2 in New York, 1 in Philly, 1 in Chicago. Anyway, opera. It's what film stars became in the 1930s and 40s, was what opera was at the time. So Zabelle starts singing around the Boston area about 1912. The first documentation sheet we have of her singing in public is at a women's minstrel show, as a matter of fact. But in the next 2 years, she's singing at Armenian events. By 1914, she is so popular that she has to take an ad out in the local Armenian language newspaper asking people not to use her name when she is not actually appearing at the event. So that is some measure of popularity, I would say, right? Okay. So, 1914, we get to the next bad thing happens. Back home in Bartizag, it's getting worse, the whole conflict, and there's news coming in. By the end of 1914, beginning of 1915, all the guns had been taken away from the Armenian population, and all of the men had been conscripted to do military work, but like building roads and stuff. And then in April 1915, the Ottoman government arrests 36 prominent Armenian individuals in Constantinople, Istanbul, among whom dentists, all kinds. There's a priest and composer that we'll be talking about who was arrested that night. Gomitas Vadarpet. And then the government goes around to all these Armenian towns and starts knocking on doors. And what they say in Bardazag, for instance, is here's what you're going to do. You're going to take all your stuff, your rugs, your furniture, everything you own, you bring it out onto the street, and you're going to sell it to all the neighboring villagers for whatever they want to pay, because you need that money right now, because you're leaving right now, and you have to pay us for your train fare. Give us your house keys, you're leaving. One train to another train to another train to the Syrian border, where 1.5 million Armenians were marched into the desert and died of starvation, famine, thirst, exposure, and where girls marching past villages, very often people come out, ask the guard in charge how much for that one, and they would just sell the girls. So that's what's going on back home, and news is coming in. And Zabelle, who had already for 6 months, end of 1914, been raising money for Armenian causes and benefit concerts, flies into action. Absolutely performing nonstop, raising money. The Hollis Theater, she gives a show, she raises whatever it was, $250 or something, and they give her a bouquet. She auctions the bouquet to raise more money still. Anything to benefit the Armenian cause. Now, it became a major thing during World War I, the Near East Relief Campaign. It was a massive philanthropic effort all around the United States to raise money for Christians in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, during the genocide. It raised tons of money. Private American citizens just poured money into it because they were told over and over and over again, give, give, give to the starving Armenian, so that for generations, Americans thought the word Armenian was always preceded by the word starving. A buddy of mine grew up in the 1950s in Baltimore, where there were 5 Armenian families, and was told generations later, eat your vegetables, don't you know there are starving Armenians? The whole nation, group of people, reduced to their suffering, reduced to their victimhood. But Zabelle throws herself into this work. Very beginning of 1915, she meets an important guy who has just come over. Who here knows the name Armenian Shamaradian? Anybody? Okay, one, yeah, which is not insignificant. Okay, Armenian Shamaradian was a singer. He was a very important singer to Armenian Americans for the decades of the teens and 20s. The most important singer of those decades in the United States. He was from Mush, a town of about 7,000 or something, about 50-50 Christian and Muslim. And he had gone to study music in Georgia, where he, among other teachers, studied under Gomitas Vadarpet. How many people know Gomitas, please? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, great, okay. Who's the great patriarch of Armenian music, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Composer, ethnographer, priest. So, Shamaradian studies under Gomitas. Shamaradian is also a revolutionary who is arrested twice for attending protests and meetings and things. The second time he's arrested, he's led out by a Ottoman military guy, Fuad Bey, who just benevolently says, look, nice young musician, you can go, keep your nose clean, go back to your village, and you can leave. So he goes back to Mush. For 3 years, he winds up teaching the chorus, living very, very poor, until he gets some money together to go to Paris. In Paris, he studies at the Schola Cantorum under Vincent d'Indy, and he studies under a composer named Pauline Viardot, who was in her 90s at the time. Her family is musical they were friends with Mozart. Old, and she was an Armenophile who had already composed a 4-handed Armenian suite. So she teaches him for free. Now, Shamaradian then gets a role starring in Gounod's Faust, the title part. and at the Paris Grand Opera, and he becomes a big star. Tours all over Europe, 1912, 13, 14. 1914, he goes to Constantinople, Istanbul, reconnects with his old teacher, the great, venerated Gomitas, and they make some records together at the beginning of 1914. Gomitas plays piano, Shamaradian sings. That's the first thing I'm going to play for you right now. Finally getting around to a record, right? So, this is a song that everybody who knows Armenian music probably knows. It's called Garunk. The words are very old. It was 300 years old at the time for sure. The earliest text of it, Harry Kazelian came across, is from Aleppo and is identical to the text that is sung here, right? It's now a 400-year-old song. Okay, I should say that when I started this project, I was contacted by a guy in Michigan named Harry Kazelian who wanted to know what I was doing with his music. Because he grew up with this stuff and he has this incredible mind. He knows so much and he reads and speaks Armenian beautifully. Just an incredible person. And then he and I both got in touch, or contacted by a guy in California named Harut Arakelian. And Harut, among other things, had been working as a private investigator and had a lot of research skills and was really driven about the history of recording among Armenians, so that he is now working on a project to collect every record ever made by an Armenian. He's amazing. Wonderful guys. So the three of us together published this book last year that's the story of this woman, Zabelle Panosian. None of the three of us could have done it individually. They should be here now. And I will continuously reference work that they did, and it'll come out of my mouth as if I did it. I didn't. We did it together. It's the three of us. None of us could have done it separately. Anyway, okay. So that said, this is the 1914 recording made of Garunk by Armenak Shamaradian with Gomitas playing piano. Pay attention to the melody. Repeats. Yep. And this is part of the work that Gomitas was doing, was as an ethnographer who was going around collecting Armenian songs and publishing them in the early 20th century, particularly in Germany. But 1914 happens, and the First World War breaks out. Shamaradian can't go back to Paris. So he, his wife, and their daughter come December 1914 to New York. April 1915, Gomitas is arrested along with these other intellectuals and sent off to a prison north of Ankara, where he has to stay for a while. More on that later. But Shamaradian makes it to the US and is immediately introduced to this bright young woman, this new star, this new singing star, Zabelle. And the two of them immediately begin doing concerts together. Detroit and Boston and New York, and New Jersey and Philadelphia, Syracuse, New York, where they were accompanied by a violinist named Nakuni, who in 1919 publishes this book of Armenian songs. Of the 10 songs that Zabelle Panosian recorded in Armenian, 7 of them are in this book. including Garunk, using the melody that we just heard. This is the 1924 edition, which is only about half the same, or 70% the same, thereabouts. There's a lot of changes that happen. Anyway, the violinist who accompanies them in Syracuse. So she's playing all the time in this area and raising a lot of money. We found that in one weekend, in the course of 3 days, she played 7 concerts between New York City and Philadelphia, going up and down New Jersey. Just relentless, raising money, including a concert specifically for girls who were becoming refugees as part of the genocide. One concert specifically for Gomitas, the depressed priest. At the end of 1916, right in the middle of all of it, she goes to Victor Records in Camden, New Jersey, and makes a demonstration record, makes a test record to try and record. She sings Grunk, which is a song that she sings at every single concert that she does. And they turn her down. A few months later, Shamaradian goes to Victor Records, makes a trial record for them. They turn him down too. All right. Now, at these concerts, Shamaradian's the star, and Zabelle's the opening act. She sings a couple of songs. Gradually, she's singing more and more. He's singing less and less. So that by 1917, 1918, she's the headliner and he's the opening act. It so happens. But she pushes for another recording session the beginning of 1917, March, April. And they go to Victor's rival, which is Columbia Records, the other major record company in the United States. Columbia's recording studios are in the Woolworth Building in New York City, then the tallest building in the world. And she made 6 records, 6 songs at this recording session. And there's a funny thing about them. This is what they look like. It's an orange label Columbia disc. And this is what I first encountered when I first heard Zabelle Panosian. I first heard Zabelle Panosian because of a man named Leo Sarkeesian, who was a member of this museum for decades. Leo was raised in Haverhill, Massachusetts. His family were from Diyarbakir. His father and uncle worked in the shoe factory there. He grew up in a trilingual Armenian, Turkish, English-speaking household. I met Leo when he was about 93 years old, about 2011, when he was just retiring after being hired for the Voice of America in 1963. He was the African music broadcaster for 50 years. Wonderful person. I was very fond of Leo, who liked to say, "Do you know why I'm the luckiest guy in the world? Because God is Armenian." Traveled all over the world. Kabul in the 50s, he's met by an Armenian delegation, having gone by jeep through the Khyber Pass. Incredible life. Anyway, at the end of his life, he was starting to disperse with his rugs and paintings and instruments and things, and we were talking about music, and he knew I loved it, and he said, "Would you like my records?" I said, "Yeah, that would be great, man. I really, yeah, thank you." So I took them all home, I listened to them all dutifully, and there was a copy of this record, this orange label Columbia from 1917 that says Zabelle Panosian on it. And it was broken, but it would still play. And I put the needle on it, and the first thing I heard was a piano and strings, which was such a bummer. That's not what you want. The inherited aesthetics among 78 collectors, let's say, is you want like authentic down-home music, right? You get piano and strings, you're dealing with somebody's aspiring values, you know? It's not what you want. But, all right, here it is. Let's listen to it. And the voice comes in, and it's pretty, and I like it. And then she does a thing. She builds a monument. It stopped me cold, killed me. And I came back to life at the end of the side, and I put the needle back down on the beginning of the side, and it played it again, and it did it again. And I said, "Okay, whoever you are, I would like to know who you are." And I included that song on a compilation CD that I released in 2011. At the time, I was able to come up with 2 sentences of biographical material. And here we are now, and it's turned into this. So, I'm just going to play you the whole side, because that's the point of all of this, why we're here right now. It's a pleasure and a privilege to share this experience with all of you. This is Zabelle Panosian in about March 1917, singing Garunk in an entirely different melody, identical words, different melody from Shamaradian and Gomitas, from anybody else, because it is the melody she learned from the lips of her countrymen in Bartizog. It is a Bartizog-specific melody and in a completely different mode from anyone else's recording, except one that Harry found decades later, who was a guy who was from Izmit right next to Bartizog. So, it's her song. She invented it. It's a peculiar work of art. No one that she knew growing up sang it like this, certainly, but this is the melody. So. Zabelle Panosian was 26 years old, living at 91 Pearson Road in Somerville, Massachusetts at the time. It's a record that spoke directly to the situation that Armenians in America found themselves in, which was a situation of missing home and not knowing what was going on. The words, roughly, in Old Armenian, sort of formal Armenian, are Crane, where are you coming from? Have you any news from home? I am servant of your voice. Hasten not to your flock, you will arrive soon enough. So that was what Armenians in America were dealing with. There's no home to go back to. Everything and everyone is gone. And the record sold like crazy. People bought it, such that it stayed in print continuously until 1931, when Columbia Records finally deleted its Armenian language catalog. So Harry found an article by a guy named Hagop Azadorian, who was born in 1903, written in the 1930s, where he described a typical Armenian picnic in Van Cortlandt Park in the Bronx, where he describes people listening to records on a wind-up gramophone machine out at the park. He says, gradually the smoke of barbecued lamb would saturate the atmosphere and mix with the other smoke of burning memories. At that point, joining this mixture would be the sonorous voice of Shah Maradian singing Hayastan, pouring out of the throat of a morning glory horn gramophone. And then you would hear the Garunk by Zabelle Panosian, and especially the Turkish language Anduni, called Egen Havasi, springing forth with sad fluctuations from the depths of Kemeni Minas' soul. And to this day, all those records were made in 1917 in New York City. And to this day, if you run across an old record collection of Armenians of that generation, those are the three records, always. Hayastan, Garunk, Egen Havasi. Kemeni Minas, whole other story, guy from Malatya who lived here in Boston, recorded amazing music, all in Turkish, including this masterpiece. Egen had tuberculosis at the time, probably had holes in his lungs when he sang it, died 6 months later. Anyway, just a side note on that. Okay, so record business stuff. This is fun for me. Hold on. Since we published the book, I answered a question for myself about this label. See, it's orange. There's only like 12 musicians that ever recorded for the Orange Columbia label. They are almost all immigrants who were classically trained. 2 Germans, 3 Armenians, 1 Japanese woman, and 2 Arabs who were the non-Western classically trained exceptions. Okay, I figured it out. Columbia Records in 1916 and 1917 was trying to move into the personal record market. In other words, you could pay them some money and they would make a record for you of whatever. And, so churches and choirs and stuff could record their own music and get records pressed to them. They cost about 75 cents a piece, which was exactly the retail price for a record when you go in and buy it from the store. So that's what the Orange label is. Zabelle never passed an audition for Columbia, and neither did Shah Maradian, and neither did Torkin Bazazian. Somebody put up the money and paid for the records to get made. They're basically private. She bought her way into the Columbia catalog, or somebody did, and I think I know who. Here's an ad from the Azg newspaper here in Boston, 1917, taken out by Madiros and Levan Tajian, brothers, who were, Madiros was a photo engraver, same occupation as Aram Panosian, and he was a political activist. What they're offering in this advertisement is you can get the first 3 Zabelle Panosian records, the first 4 Armenag Shah Maradian records, and a toy record player all together as a package for $17. The average cost of the most popular Victor machine at the time, 1917, cost $100. They are using sound recording during First World War, immediately during the genocide, as a way of collectivizing Armenians, of gathering culture and language and presenting Armenianness to people through records. They had, in fact, already done private recordings for Columbia, 1909, 1910, 1911, of themselves singing with piano. So 90% sure that's who paid for the Panosian material to get pressed. Then Columbia just kept it in print for a long time, or that record anyway. The other ones went out of print. Now, more pedantic record business stuff. Sometimes, when you put the needle down on a copy of Zabelle's record called Garunk, Columbia E3503, with this matrix number, sometimes what you get is not what we just heard. Sometimes what you get is this. What's up with the Tweety birds? Now, in fact, that's not actually what you hear when you put the needle on it, because I slowed that down to 70 RPM. Because when you put the needle down on it, what happens is it's her singing Garung a major third higher than on this disc. What happened when Zabelle recorded? She recorded many takes. Columbia's process at the time was everybody gets 2 takes. Doesn't matter if you're a big opera star, immigrant right off the boat, 2 takes, master and a backup. That's it. The idea of a best take had not been invented yet, right? Zabelle is working so hard that on the day in 1917 when she first records Garung, she makes 5 takes of it. And then the following year, 14 months later in 1918, she goes back into the studio and re-records Garung, 2 more takes, and records a bunch of other songs, and she intends them to be 12-inch discs. And whoever was paying for the records to be pressed told Columbia, no, that's not going to work. Armenians will not pay $1.50 for a record, which is what a 12-inch would have to be for this private pressing thing. They'll only pay $1, which is what a 10-inch costs. And they know this because they put out a 12-inch disc by Armenian Shamaradian that no one bought. It was a sales flop. His records sell like crazy, except this one. So what they did, they sped up Zabelle's 1918 performances so the grooves would fit on the side of a disc. And take 7 is the one that stays in print until 1931 with the little birdies. And so when you put the needle on it, her voice is too high and twittery and squeaky. And so maybe for decades, that's the one that people heard and thought, she's not very good. Maybe that's one of the reasons she got forgotten. I don't know. Harry Kazelian said that he heard that version and didn't think much of it. It wasn't until he heard Garung exists now in 4 separate takes that we know of. 1, 2, 5, and 7 were all released on discs because whoever was sending away to Columbia to get more copies pressed up maybe wasn't specifying which take they wanted printed. Anyway, so record business stuff, but significant to this performer's career. So here we go. Now, the question becomes, how was Zabelle received at the time? And I would say mostly quite well. She received very strong criticism from another guy who studied under Dondi at the Schola Cantorum, Prof. Calafian, who was a pompous jerk by most accounts. But he went to a concert of hers here in Boston, January 30th, 1917, with Shamaradian, reviewed it for Osk. He liked Shamaradian fine. He thought some of the material was below him, but he tore Panosian to pieces in the review. And he did it on political terms, that her music was too Turkish, Turkified, and that her voice was too thin and too reedy, and that she would be better served to sing operetta. Rough to hear from a grand old man, right? All right, well, anyway, he's a jerk. One can hear between the April 1917 and the July 1918 recordings of Grunk, she has gotten better. She has intentionally worked and studied and trained and built up the underneath of her voice. And we have some documentation of that as well, because there's a review of a guy who went and saw her in 1919, we don't know his name, but he says that he accompanied her on piano in 1916. And he begins the review this way. Just because you're popular doesn't mean you're good. While Zabelle Panosian's tone is beautiful, it is as uncultivated as a flower in an untouched forest. Nature gave her the gift which needs to be cultivated to blossom to its full beauty if she focuses on European songs. She was singing, of course, not only Armenian songs, but also songs in French and English and Italian. And she was, at the end of many of the concerts, it was My Country 'Tis of Thee, waving the flag. This, he says, is what I thought when I accompanied her 3 years ago on piano, 1916. So, when I went to the concert, February 9th, 1919, up until now, Zabelle Panosian was known for Armenian songs, which she sang in true Armenian style. Take that, Prof. Kalafian. The writer then focused on her English, and the reaction to Meyerbeer's Shadow Song was overwhelming. People applauded it more than the Armenian songs, because she was able to display her vocal talents more. Her voice competed with the flute. Her technique was great. At one point, her voice and the flute were so harmonious that one thought it was two flutes. She produced these notes with clarity and ease, and it's obvious she's better trained than she was 3 years ago. For her performance of Armenian songs, to her compliment, she didn't alter them, but instead showed a better grip. Natsa Shun, which she never recorded, was the best received of them. It's fair to say that she is the best Armenian female voice. In her singing style, one can hear oriental warmth and color. She strongly speaks to Armenians and awakens memories from home. And she just, if reviews are to be believed, she just got better and better for the next 15, 20 years. Better and better. But she never recorded again. When Armistice comes, get to 1919, she is doing very well. There's a big feature article about her in an Armenian feminist journal in Constantinople, Istanbul in 1919. The Musical Courier, which was the big classical music magazine for the Western establishment, runs a full-page feature on her with photos. So she's not just this immigrant girl anymore. She's a real singer who has she could be one of us, Americans, is the point of the article, kind of, right? And in 1919, her husband goes Constantinople, Istanbul to locate family members. Right at that time, she gets a role in Boston in a biblical spectacular called King of Kings, based on the Book of Kings, David and Solomon. She plays Abishag. It's a big spectacular, 500 background singers, 300 dancers. So that runs for a while. Her husband gets back. She immediately gets a passport with her daughter, who's then 11 years old. And they're going to go overseas, and they're going to try and meet up with some family and do some music stuff. 6 months, the application says. Gertrude Duena and her bank both vouch for her. And they go. And first they stop in England for a minute, and then they go to Paris. And she sets up at the Hotel Vernet, where she stays for 2 years. I went. It's a nice place. Right by the Champs-Élysées, Michelin star restaurant. I gave him a copy of the book. Anyway, I also went today to Pearson, to the old house, which was, by the way, built 1920, the year that they moved out. Her husband moved to New York City. She goes on tour. She stays on tour for 2 years in Paris, but 4 years altogether. She goes to Egypt, probably visits with the same people who got her passage over, and she goes to Rome. She sings at La Scala, the lead in the Barber of Seville, people in the audience cheering, "Long live Armenia." But the first thing she does when she gets to Paris, the very first thing she does, is hooks up with some Armenian intellectuals, doctors, and she tracks down Gomitas, who is by then living in a psychiatric facility there in Paris. After he was the night he was arrested, on the train ride, the flickering moon through the trees, he starts hallucinating and feeling paranoid and worried. And he suffers from mental problems the rest of his life. First a psychiatric facility in Constantinople, Istanbul, and then 2 different ones in Paris the rest of his life. She tracks him down there. The people she talks to says, don't go. Don't go. The last person who went, he threw his shoes at them. Don't go. I want to go. She goes. She brings these doctors with. They do not tell Gomitas that they're doctors because he hates doctors. And they find him there in the courtyard, sort of walking around, talking to himself. And they quietly approach. And he looks up and he says to her, do I know you from somewhere? Are you a student of mine? And she says, yes, I am a student of yours, but from far away. Oh, where are you from? Boston. Bostan. Vegetable garden in Turkish. Are there a lot of vegetables there? And she immediately tightens up and thinks that he's losing track of the conversation immediately. There is, of course, this stigma about mental illness, right? This is before psychiatric drugs, you know. Where does it come from? Where does it lead? How infectious is it? So she says, no, Reverend Father, I've come to ask you some questions about music, if that's okay. And he's ask away, anything you like. She says, the music you compose for choir, is it okay to sing that for solo voice? And he says, if you know the song, sing it however you like. It's yours, take it. By all means. She says, thank you very much. And look, we don't want to tire you out. She backs out of the conversation almost immediately. She does not say that she did a benefit concert for him and raised hundreds of dollars in that money to send to him. She does not say that she knows Shamaradian, who of course he's known for decades. She does not say that she's from Bartizag, where he had been himself 1910, 1912. She could have said any of those things. She doesn't. She says, I don't want to tire you out. He says, fine. You come back sometime, you sing for me, I'll sing for you. Good. And she leaves, and she writes an account in the first person of her visit for an Armenian newspaper there in Paris, La Renaissance. I've forgotten the Armenian name for the paper. It's the only first-person account we have of her speaking in her own voice, being a real artist, doing research, going straight to the source to develop her work. You see? Harry and Harut disagree about who actually discovered the article. Neither of them seems to remember, but Harut translated the whole thing. It's in the book. It's the centerpiece of the whole book. It's one of the great documents of early 20th century Armenian music. As far as I'm concerned, I am exceedingly proud that we're able to present it. So, after Egypt, after Rome, Zabelle comes home, 1924. In Italy, she had, on a couple of occasions, sung using her husband's first name as her surname, so Zabelle Aram. When she gets home, she immediately begins using the last name Aram as her name. Why? A few reasons, maybe. All right, 1924 is the passage of Johnson-Reed. Raise your hand if you know what the Johnson-Reed Act is. Yep, it's always 2 or 3, but it's always only 2 or 3. The quota system. Okay, so America was going through a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia. Between 1880 and 1920, 1,000 people a day were immigrating just through Ellis Island, just through one port. It was the largest wave of immigration in US history per capita. 1907, the year that Zabelle arrives, is in fact the single largest year of immigration in American history. The foreign-born population of the United States during that period is always between 13 and 14%. Do you happen to know the foreign-born population of the United States right now? 14%. So, 1920, big hit song by Nora Bayes. It was recorded by 5 other people at the time, called The Argentines, the Portuguese, and the Greeks. There's a verse in it that goes, well, there's the Argentines and the Portuguese, the Armenians and the Greeks. They don't know the language, they don't know the law, yet they vote in the country of the free. Now the funny thing, when we start to sing, my country 'tis of thee. None of us know the words but the Argentines and the Portuguese and the Greeks. It's a song that's all about the anxiety of America changing religion, changing color, changing demographically. More and more Catholics, more and more Orthodox, more and more Jews, right? People are getting uptight about this. And the question among the establishment, who are Protestants, is, are we really going to let these people vote in our elections? So in 1924, America passed a law for immigration federally that said a certain number of people are allowed in from each country on earth. The numbers that they've initially based those on were from a 1890 census preceding this, or beg your pardon, 1880 census preceding this large wave. It was an overt attempt to reset America exactly the color white it had been 2 generations ago. And it worked. Johnson Reed was not overturned until 1965. During that period, 1924, 1965, 120 Armenians a year were allowed in the United States to become citizens. That's all. How many people from Asia or Africa during those 40 years? 0. 0. So, my father's generation grew up in the 1950s, right? Grew up in the most monocultural, monolingual America that there ever was. And when people, after 1965, began coming from Asia, Africa, South and Central America, the Middle East, they saw 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, America change demographically, change color, change religion. And they have said, this is not our country. Exactly the same way as happened in 1920, right? Anyway, this is the America that Zabelle comes back to. So she is not anymore Zabelle Panosian, she is Zabelle Ram. It's a little more vague. It's not denying Armenianness. It's just a little less obviously Armenian. And she's getting up and she rents out town hall, she rents out Hollis, 1,000-seaters, and she does 1.5-hour, 2-hour concerts where she gets up and sings Italian, French, English, Armenian songs with a costume change for each that she researches at the New York Public Library. She's a serious artist, right? Through the 20s, she's just getting better and better. She goes on tour in California, car crash, broken ribs, shock, out of commission for 2 months, but gets right back on stage and continues performing. During the 30s, she's on the radio some. She attends Columbia for a little bit in New York, where her family has moved, 183rd Street. The performances that she's doing gradually become less and less prestigious. Little tiny opera companies that don't last. She's on the same bill with like dog acts, like vaudeville kind of stuff. Less and less prestigious, you know? Right around then, say Harry Kazelian noticed. There was an Armenian event where there was a soprano in 1931 who wasn't Zabelle, where it always would have been Zabelle before. They got somebody else. Why? Couple reasons, maybe. Number one, over the middle of the 20th century, there was, I think, and other people here may have thoughts about this, they can correct me, a certain level of genocide fatigue among Armenians in America. There was a certain, we've been talking about this so much for so long. And she was the voice, the face of that generation, of the genocide era. Maybe it was enough already. Maybe it's time for some fresh blood. Maybe we're Americans and we're joining in on this thing now. We're focused on that. We've got other political problems with the new country. There's the question about the Soviet Union, etc. Anyway, maybe she isn't that. But more important, what happened in 1931 for Zabelle? She turned 40. And what happens with female performers historically, over and over again, when you get to be in your 40s? The line in Veep, Julia Louise-Dreyfus says, "My career is over the day I can no longer wear sleeveless dresses." Zabelle had been very photogenic. She was cute. And she gets to be middle-aged. Maybe that's part of what's going on here. So, something's going on. Gradually over the 1930s and 40s, her star just fades out. Meanwhile, her daughter, 1934, at the same age that Zabelle was, when Zabelle became a big star, mid-20s, starts her own career as a dancer. They have gone back and forth between the US and Spain and France a couple of times during the 20s. And her daughter got real into flamenco and got very good and changed her last name to Otero and represented herself for the rest of her life as having had a Spanish father and a mother who is a well-known American opera star. She changed her last name to Otero because there was a big famous courtesan of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, a woman who was literally famous for being beautiful, named La Belle Otero. So the implication was that she might have been the daughter of this Spanish courtesan, right? So she, in 1934, stars in a few short films by a new comedian named Bob Hope. She's a dancer in these little films made in New York City. And then she gets on the boat, goes over to England, becomes an artist model, and then over to Spain, France, Germany. From 1935 to 1941. So the Spanish Revolution and the rise of Nazism. Meanwhile, she is representing herself the entire time as Roma. When Germans were beginning to round up Roma people and put them in camps, in an alarming echo of what happened to her mother's home. Anyway, 1941, the day before the Nazis come into Paris and Paris falls, Adrina, was her name, Zabelle's daughter, gets on a boat, gets out, makes it to the US, starts performing at the Biltmore Hotel in New York City, and then tours all over the US. Marina Svetlova, who was the prima ballerina of the Metropolitan Opera, takes Adrina on tour for several seasons, and they do one-nighters all over the hinterlands of the western United States, Butte, Montana, and all these little cowpoke towns. They're introducing flamenco and classical ballet to the hinterlands of America during the Second World War in a period of rationing when you're not supposed to be burning tire rubber. But that's what they do. So, during the 1940s, Adrina tours South Africa. She goes to Japan. She's in Canada a lot, Florida a lot. She and her mother go together to Argentina and Uruguay and give collaborative concerts where one dances and the other one sings alternating acts, right? So that's sort of the end of Zabelle's career, though. By the 60s, she's really only appearing at literary events in New York City. She's 70-something years old. By 1972, Kathy Barbarian is from here, right? She's from Boston, the mezzo-soprano, Kathy Barbarian, who is state-of-the-art technology in vocal music in the United States, gives an interview to Charles Armenian, the composer, where she says, once upon a time, there was an Armenian girl who was a very big star, but she just kind of faded into nothing, and nobody knows where she is. Zabelle was alive and well in New York City, and that's exactly who she's talking about. Okay, there's one other point I want to make about Zabelle and her records and her voice and her as an artist. Was Zabelle a good singer or not? Of the songs that she recorded, 11 songs, 10 are in Armenian, 1 is in French. The one that's in French is from a obscure 19th century opera by Lucien David called The Pearl of Brazil. It is a direct cover of a record made 6 months earlier for Victor Records by the lead singer, the lead soprano for the Metropolitan Opera, whose name was Amelita Gallicurci. Anybody know Amelita Gallicurci? State-of-the-art coloratura soprano. The best singer in the world, basically. Her and Tetrazzini, I would say, are the two big ones. Gallicurci was exactly the same age as Panosian was, 6 months difference. She was from Milanese nobility and was very popular, made a lot of records. I'm going to play you the last minute of a Gallicurci record of her singing a song called Charmant Oiseau. And then I'm going to play you the last minute of Zabelle singing exactly the same portion of exactly the same song. So we can figure this out together, right? So here's Gallikerchi, 1917, Camden, New Jersey, for Victor Records. Oh, I beg you. This is Zabelle. Right. Sorry. Okay, so that's Zabelle recorded in 1918, not released until a year later after Armistice, when Zabelle's reputation as a classical singer of things other than Armenian music is getting a little traction. But here, in fact, is Emily de Gallikerchi's version from which she derived hers. Is Zabelle as good as Emily de Gallikerchi? I'm going to answer it for you, no. But no one is. No one is. She's the best. Zabelle is very good by 27 years old. And again, if reviews are to be believed, she just got better for another decade at least. So it's a shame she didn't record more. I think it's significant and important that we think of, I sent this book to every classical music reviewer I could find in the United States, a digital copy for review. Nobody touched it. America is not interested in the contributions of immigrants to this country, by and large, due largely to the question of the English language being the basis of our sense of a rooted identity as, Americans, this whole trajectory of jazz, blues, gospel, country that we're supposed to represent as Americana. But I think it's a mistake, evidenced by somebody as good as Zabelle Panosian. By 1982, Zabelle Panosian had no family left. She was 90-something, 91 years old, living in New York City. Her sister had immigrated, had children. They'd had a falling out. Her sister did have children of her own. When I wrote 10 years ago for the Armenian Weekly here in Watertown, an article in which I lamented, nobody remembers Zabelle Panosian, I got an email from a guy named Varojan Karats in Connecticut who said, "That's my great aunt. I knew her. He's the last person alive who touched her." 90-something years old now. He said, "I knew she sang. I never knew she had a career. Never knew she was a star of any kind. It never came up." So, her two brothers who had immigrated to the United States, bachelors their whole lives, died without children. Her father had died of starvation in the genocide. Her husband had died decades earlier. And her daughter apparently died in the mid-1970s. So by 1982, Zabelle, living in New York City, gave the Armenian General Benevolent Union $756,939. The third largest donation in AGPU's history up to that point, and the equivalent now of about $2 million. She died 4 years later in 1986, at which point the AGPU gifted her an obituary, which read, Zabelle Panosian, the extremely well-known, beloved singer of the Armenian-American old generation, closed her eyes forever, leaving behind her good name and her remembrance-worthy work. Peace be to her tormented soul. And then, an hour in clamor and a quarter in room. Nothing. Nothing. For decades. Zabelle was forgotten. It is through places like this where the physical evidence of lives, of artists, of thinkers, of people is housed and can continue to live and be available so that when somebody does put the needle on it and their heart is changed by it, maybe it'll live again, you know? So this is why I do this, is to be able to carry this all forward and hope that it'll change you and you'll remember Zabelle now. And she'll get to, because she's part of you now, get to take on some life. You're all very kind for spending this time with me. Thank you very much. Good night.